I was 18 when I first started house sitting for the Delacroix family. Their estate was unlike anything I'd ever seen, perched at the edge of a dense forest with an expansive glass facade that reflected the dark silhouettes of towering pines. I had grown up in a small apartment above my father's hardware store, so being entrusted with such a luxurious, sprawling property felt surreal. The Delacroix were wealthy but kind world travelers who always left detailed instructions for caring for their home during their extended trips abroad. On my second summer caring for the estate, I arrived on a warm June evening. The house smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, and the light spilling through the windows made it feel less intimidating than I remembered. Still, the isolation pressed against me as I locked the front door behind me. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, and cell reception was spotty at best. It didn't bother me, I was used to solitude, and their Wi-Fi worked well enough for me to stream movies and chat with friends. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I fell into a rhythm of feeding the family's Siamese cat, Oliver, watering the houseplants, and spending my evenings in the airy living room that overlooked the forest. The floor-to-ceiling windows made it feel like I was suspended in a dream. I loved curling up on the oversized leather couch, reading or watching a movie, as the trees outside swayed like silent sentinels. One night, as I flipped through a novel, I heard something. A faint tapping. I froze, listening. It came again, irregular and soft, like knuckles brushing glass. I glanced at Oliver, who was curled up by the fireplace. He raised his head, ears perked. That small movement sent a shiver through me. The tapping wasn't my imagination. I stood slowly, scanning the room. The windows stretched the length of the living area, the dark forest beyond impenetrable. The tapping had stopped, but unease lingered. I walked to the kitchen, turning on every light I passed, and grabbed my phone. There was no signal. Great. Back in the living room, I closed the curtains, blotting out the darkness. I convinced myself it was a bird or a branch, nothing more. "Walker," said the voice. I convinced myself it was a bird or a branch, nothing more. Still, I double-checked the locks on the doors before returning to the couch. Oliver had settled back into his nap, and I tried to follow his example, focusing on my book instead of the tight knot forming in my chest. An hour later, I heard it again. Tapping, deliberate this time, on the glass. My pulse quickened as I stared at the drawn curtains, half expecting a hand to slip through them. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and crept to the window, pulling the fabric aside in one swift motion. Nothing, just my own reflection staring back at me. Relief and frustration mingled in my chest. I closed the curtain again, my grip tightening on the poker. "It's nothing," I muttered aloud, trying to reassure myself. Oliver yawned in reply, unimpressed. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old house felt magnified in the silence. Around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off on the couch, the poker resting beside me. The next morning, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Outside the largest window, on the damp earth just below the glass, were footprints. Barefoot. They led from the edge of the forest to the house and then back again, as if someone had come right up to the window to watch me. My heart pounded as I traced the trail. The prints were fresh, and whoever had left them must have been close last night. I called the Delacroix immediately, but the line went to voicemail. Panic rising, I considered driving into town, but the idea of leaving the house felt equally dangerous. Instead, I armed myself with the poker and spent the day checking every lock and window. By evening, I had calmed down enough to convince myself that it could have been a prank or even an animal. Still, I kept the curtains closed and stayed alert. That night, as I sat on the couch, I heard it again, not tapping this time, but clattering up the stairs, down to the dining room, down to the back hallway, then slowly and deliberate, circling the house. I held my breath, clutching the poker. The sound stopped near the back door where there was a narrow window with no curtain. I forced myself to look. A face stared back at me. Pale skin, dark eyes, and a smile that sent ice through my veins. The man pressed his palm against the glass, tilting his head as if studying me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the couch, and scrambled to my feet. When I looked again, he was gone. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, shoved Oliver into his carrier, and bolted to my car. I drove straight into town, not stopping until I reached a diner with bright fluorescent lights and people who felt real. I called the police from there. They searched the property but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Still, I refused to return. I left the keys with a neighbor and never heard from the Delacroix again, though I later learned they sold the house the following year. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw that night. All I know is that I'll never be able to shake the memory of that smile, pressed against the glass, watching me. For months, I had been living in a little apartment above the workshop where I apprenticed. The building, old and creaky, sat on the edge of a narrow canal in the heart of the city's artisan quarter. My days were spent repairing antique clocks, crafting intricate gears, and practicing the steady patience my mentor demanded. The nights, however, were mine to fill with books, sketches, and the quiet hum of solitude. It started with a dream. In it, I stood in a grand hall lined with mirrors, though none of them reflected me. Instead, each glass surface shimmered with faint images of people I didn't recognize. Old, young, smiling, crying. But as I approached one, the image faded, replaced by something else entirely. A tall figure wrapped in shadow, its face obscured. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched me. When I woke, the dream felt distant, almost forgettable. I chalked it up to exhaustion and shook it off. Yet the following night, it happened again. This time, the shadowy figure was closer, towering over me, its presence heavy and suffocating. I woke in a sweat, the kind of breathless terror that lingers even in the brightest morning light. The third night, I locked every door and window before bed. My mentor often joked that I worked too late into the night, that the glow of my lamp attracted restless spirits. I laughed it off, but that night I double-checked the locks anyway. When sleep came, the shadow returned. It reached out this time, long, thin fingers stretching toward me. I ran in the dream, through twisting halls that seemed to loop endlessly, until I slammed into a door. Behind it was my room. The moment I crossed the threshold, I woke. The room was dark, save for the faint orange glow of the canal light filtering through the shutters. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I told myself it was just a nightmare, nothing more. Then I heard it. A creak, soft but unmistakable, the sound of wood shifting under weight. I sat up, every muscle tense. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and there it was. The door to my workshop, the one I always kept closed at night, was slightly ajar. I stared at it, waiting for my brain to explain it away. Maybe I'd left it open, maybe a draft had pushed it, but I knew better. Heart hammering, I reached for the small screwdriver I kept on the bedside table. A tool, a weapon, something. I slid out of bed, my bare feet brushing the cold floor, and crept toward the door. As I approached, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic scraping, like metal on wood. My throat tightened. I pushed the door open with trembling hands, revealing the dimly lit workshop. It was empty. Or so I thought. My tools were scattered across the bench, the way I'd left them. But then I saw it. A faint smear of something dark and wet on the floorboards. My eyes followed the trail which led under the workbench. I bent down, gripping the screwdriver so tightly my knuckles ached, and peered into the shadows. Nothing, just cobwebs and sawdust. Relieved but still shaken, I backed away and closed the door, locking it firmly this time. I returned to bed, my pulse gradually slowing. Maybe I'd imagined the sound, or the smear was just oil from a clumsy spill. That's what I told myself as I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, sunlight did little to ease my nerves. I inspected the workshop thoroughly, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. That night I left a candle burning on the windowsill, hoping the soft light would keep the nightmares and whatever else at bay. I didn't. I woke to a sharp, stinging pain in my calf. At first I thought it was a cramp, but when I sat up and threw off the blanket, I froze. There was a thin red line etched into my skin like a scratch. Confused and terrified, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and that's when I heard it again, the creak. But this time, it wasn't coming from the workshop. It was coming from under the bed. My breath hitched and I froze. The air felt heavier, colder. Slowly, I leaned down, lowering my head until I could see the shadows beneath the bed. A face stared back at me. Its features were obscured by darkness, but the eyes, glinting, unblinking, burned into mine. I jerked upright, stumbling back against the wall, and clutched the screwdriver like a lifeline. The thing under the bed moved then, a slow, deliberate slide toward the edge. I bolted. I ran out of the apartment barefoot, down the narrow staircase and into the cobblestone streets. I didn't stop until I reached the night guard's post by the square. They returned with me, weapons drawn, but by the time we reached the apartment, the intruder was gone. What they left behind, however, was worse. My tools had been arranged in a perfect circle on the floor of the workshop, and at its center was a single charred gear, the same one I'd been repairing the day this all began. I moved out the next morning, leaving the workshop, the apartment, and that shadow behind. Or so I hope, because sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still hear the creak of floorboards, and I wonder if it ever really left. It was one of those bitterly cold January evenings when the world felt as if it had frozen in place. Snow was falling relentlessly, piling up like it had nowhere else to go, and the wind cut through the air with a sharp sting. I'm lucky in some ways. I work from home, so I didn't have to face the harshness of the weather as much as others. But that night, even the short trips to the grocery store felt exhausting, the cold seeping into my bones. The day had been draining. Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, my internet connection cutting in and out, making everything more frustrating than productive. By 6 in the evening, my internet completely gave up on me, and I decided to call it a night. The sun had already set, and I took a moment to gather myself before I took my dog Gracie outside for a quick bathroom break. The air was piercing, and I could feel the chill biting at my skin even as I hurried back inside. As soon as I shut the door, I wrapped myself in a blanket, settling onto the couch with the TV on in the background. I wasn't really paying attention to the news, but it made the silence of the house feel less oppressive. Gracie, on the other hand, was far from calm. After a few minutes of lying next to me, she suddenly perked up, her ears twitching. I didn't think much of it at first, but then a growl rumbled low in her throat. I shot up from the couch, my heart thumping as I peered toward the front door. "Hi!" Through the window I saw him, a figure standing still, almost too still, near the side of the road. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, and in that moment I felt that strange mix of curiosity and unease wash over me. It was late, the snow was thick, and no one should have been out in this kind of weather. I didn't stand out there long enough to get a good look, feeling the weight of the cold pulling me back inside. Gracie's growling had stopped by the time I returned to the couch, and I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, just a person taking a walk. The night was too quiet for anything else. The rest of the evening was uneventful, though I kept an eye on Gracie, who seemed to be calmer now. I took her out again at 10, thinking surely no one would still be out in the freezing snow. The wind had picked up, making it feel even colder, but everything seemed normal as I stood there on the porch. When we got back inside, I figured the worst of the night was behind me. I went upstairs to bed, the exhaustion from the long day catching up with me. As I settled under the covers, I could feel sleep starting to take over, but my eyes snapped open when I saw Gracie standing at the bedroom door. She wasn't barking, but her posture was tense, her body low to the ground, her tail tucked. Something was off. "Gracie?" I whispered, calling her over, but she didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the door, unblinking. I stood up slowly, my instincts telling me something wasn't right. I walked quietly to the door, placing my ear against it, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. Silence. My hand found the door handle, and just as I was about to twist it, I felt a sharp jolt of fear. Someone was on the other side. I could feel the handle moving ever so slightly, as though someone was testing it. My breath caught in my throat, my heart racing. At first I stayed still, unsure of what to do. But the pressure on the door started to grow more forceful, and panic set in. I rushed to the bed and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I scrambled to find something, anything to defend myself with. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the nearest thing, a clothing iron. It was ridiculous, but it felt like my only option. As I fumbled with my phone, trying to explain the situation, the sound of the door handle twisting abruptly stopped. The silence that followed felt even worse. I waited, frozen, holding my breath, listening for any movement. I knew they were still there, waiting. Minutes passed, like hours. I heard nothing. My mind was running wild, every worst-case scenario playing out in my head. The 911 operator told me to stay on the line and not to open the door. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving away from the door, down the hallway. I couldn't bring myself to move for a long time. When the police finally arrived, I let out the breath I didn't know I was holding. They found the front door wide open, likely picked by whoever had been trying to get in. There were snow-covered footprints all over the hallway, but there was no sign of the person. It was as though they had vanished without a trace. What unsettled me most, though, was the realization that nothing had been stolen. This was impossible. The officer came out here in seconds and began going through the house. They weren't interested in taking anything from the house. No, they had been after me. And I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I do know that I'm lucky Gracie was there to protect me. Without her instincts, I might not have even known someone was outside in the first place. She stayed close to me after that, refusing to leave my side, as if she knew I was still in danger. I'm not sure I'll ever fully feel safe in that house again, but I'll always be grateful for her watchful eyes. The police never found any further evidence and the case was closed, but every night when I lay down to sleep, I can't shake the feeling that the person is still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come back. I try not to think about it too much, but there's always a small part of me that wonders if I'll ever be truly safe again, and I know that no matter where I am, Gracie will always have my back.